Ben Macdui, Giant Mountain by Ann Vastano. I am not sure if any of you are familiar with the Scottish legend of the Big Grey Man of Ben Macdui. Ben Macdui is the name of the largest mountain in the Cairngorm mountain range. The story goes that the Big Grey Man is a giant ghostly figure who roams the mountain slopes. He has been compared to similar fearsome creatures like the Yeti who lives in the Himalayas and Bigfoot from South America. Walkers over the past 100 years have told of their sightings of this huge, grey, ominous figure. Many have heard his chilling footsteps behind them. But when they have turned around, there has been no one there, only a strange feeling of unease. This is the story of a wee boy who may actually have met him. Mr. McPherty was taking his school class out on a field trip. It had started out a grand, clear but cold morning. They had been warming up nicely for the last few hours on the slow but sure ascent of the Highland mountain of Ben Macdui. "Keep going, you stragglers. It'll be worth the effort," he puffed. "There are the most splendid views from the summit," Mr. McPherty shouted impatiently to the dilly-dalliers. "We've been walking for hours, sir," whined a voice from the back of the dawdlers. "I can't feel my feet, sir. They've gone numb, sir. My legs have stopped working, sir." "I just don't know. Kids today, they just don't have the stamina." McPherty shook his head and whispered under his breath. The well-worn path passed around a small cairn built with neatly placed lichen-covered boulders. "This looks like a nice place for a sit-down, sir, don't you think?" said a red-faced, red-headed third year who wheezed dramatically as he pointed hopefully to the stone marker. "It's not the mountain we conquer, but ourselves." These were the wise words of the famous mountaineer Edmund Hillary. Mr. McPherty puffed out his chest proudly and marched on. "Onwards and upwards," he blasted, pointing his walking stick aloft. "Now, this is the second highest mountain in Britain," boomed Mr. McPherty. "Queen Victoria herself scaled this mountain on the back of a pony, also called Victoria," he droned on. "Lucky Queenie, I wish I had a pony," whined a white-faced girl, looking and sounding very unimpressed. "Of course, there are some ridiculous stories bandied about, telling of a big grey man, yetis, abominable snowmen and other strange mountain marvels." He sniffed arrogantly and readjusted his spectacles, which were steaming up with the effort of the climb. "But that's all fairies and folklore. I like to stick to the facts." McPherty turned around to see if anyone was listening. There certainly seemed a lot of chatter. "I'll be testing you on the facts," he warned, his cheeks reddening. Then, just as if from nowhere, mist silently descended. The chatter trailed off. The mist took the form of a queer grey cloud which began to swirl around. Ribbons of heavy dampness wove and swept as waves around them. The children tried to wave the smog away, but it became colder, more dense and deeply gloomy. "I'm scared," said the girl with the white face. Now she was turning slightly green. "I can't see where I'm going," said the boy with the red face and the red hair. "Come along now. Gather round, class. Let's just calm ourselves," Mr. McPherty instructed, his voice faltering a little. And then, from the grey cloud emerged a giant, dark figure. Mr. McPherty turned white, threw his compass and map into the air and screamed at the top of his voice. "It's the great grey giant, a yeti, it's abominable, it's a run for your lives!" Mr. McPherty and the children turned and ran as fast as they could, screaming hysterically all the way back or down the mountainside. The echoes of their cries rebounded off the mountain ridges, slopes and knolls, loud and piercing, and then quieter and quieter, and then just a faint cry. The mist-shrouded giant shook his head sadly. He hadn't even got close enough to say hello that time. It didn't matter whether he met a school party, dog walkers, mountaineers or hill runners. One glimpse and they would hurtle back down the way they had come, with the hairs on the backs of their necks standing on end. Perhaps it was his great height, or even his wild, long, unkempt beard, or maybe the layers of coats and jumpers, scarves and hats that he wore, things that had been left behind in haste or negligence, and that this gentle giant only wanted to return to its owners. The mist began to creep in now, thicker than ever. He would collect a few more berries for his tea and make his way home. Just then, he heard a muffled cry, and following the sound, he walked over a steep heather bank and down towards an area of scree. There, curled in the heather, was a small boy, snivelling. "Are you all right, laddie?" asked the giant. The boy looked up, startled. "Ah!" The boy screamed, terrified as he looked into the huge, weathered face staring back at him. "Oh!" The giant yelled back, equally shaken at the boy's scream, except the giant's yell sounded like thunderclaps, causing the ground to shake underneath them. Big tears were falling down the little boy's face now as he cowered like a rabbit in headlights. "Hey, don't be scared, wee man," said the giant, carefully stepping back. "I won't hurt you," he smiled gently. "Are you all right? It looks like you might be hurt." The boy looked for a moment at the mammoth figure. "I think I twisted my ankle," he offered bravely as he hugged his legs closer to him. The giant reached out cautiously and lightly touched the boy's ankle with his large fingers. The boy flinched. "Oh, aye, it's only twisted," said the giant reassuringly. "Come on now, let me give you a hand down the mountain. This bad weather is moving in fast. You need to catch up with the rest of your group." The dense cloud poured in around them. At that moment, a large flake of snow landed and melted on the boy's nose, closely followed by another and another, until the whole sky was full of flurrying flakes of snow. The light around them had turned a dark submarine blue. The giant stooped forward. "What's your name, laddie?" Archie Mackintosh," answered the boy cautiously. "Well, Mackintosh, I can feel it in my bones. There's a big storm coming. But don't you worry yourself, laddie. I'll get you down this mountainside, no problem. Here, put these on." The giant handed the boy a large woolly jumper, hat and scarf, which had been part of his many-layered outfit. The snow was settling lightly, a thin dusting on the heather brush. "I'm Ben, by the way. Ben Macdui, after the hill. Grand to make your acquaintance." The gentle giant scooped up the boy in his arms easily and began to bound down the deep fell side, leaping as confidently as a mountain goat from boulder to hummock. The ground trembled and shook under his weight, but Archie felt safe and warm in the giant's great arms. In what seemed like no time at all, they neared the car park at the foot of the mountain, only to see the school bus screeching off in a cloud of exhaust fumes. "Oh, no, is that daft teacher off without you?" Ben stood staring after the bus. Archie looked forlorn. Thick flakes of snow were swirling faster and more furiously. Darting white feathers of ice pelted and stung their faces. It was disorientating. It was erasing the paths. The snow-reeling wind was picking up, whipping gusts, bending and straining all in its path. Blizzard. The giant paused and then announced, "We need to get some shelter, and quick." Ben again gathered up Archie in his arms and began striding back along the hillside. The wind howled, whipped and lashed. Ben stopped momentarily to regain his bearings. The blizzard had become a whiteout. The snow was forming deep dunes. The towering figure, despite his strength and height, was struggling against the might of nature. Hunched against the slicing winds, protecting the small boy in his charge, he trudged ever slower through the banks of drifting snow, hypnotised by the fluttering flakes, mesmerising, falling heavy and soft. Finally Ben squinted under his snow-covered brow and spied two vaguely familiar shapes in the distance. As they drew closer, he was relieved to see two large, dark Caledonian pine trees, and between them stood a large rock face. "This is my shelter stone," Ben announced, placing Archie gently on the ground and beckoning him inside. Archie turned around once more and looked at the whiteout that had become the mountainside. Keen for warmth and shelter, he made his way between the gap in the rocks. Archie took a moment to adjust his eyes to the light. He was surprised how roomy the shelter stone was. More of a large chamber, really. The back wall was dominated by a large open fireplace. Archie could make out a large comfortable chair, a heavy wooden table covered with gloves, scarves, boots, flasks, picnic boxes. In front of the hearth lay a great granite-coloured rug. "Here, Jock," called Ben. The great granite rug leapt off the floor. After one frightening moment, Archie realised the rug was in fact the biggest dog he had ever seen. "Say hello to young Archie McIntosh," Ben gestured to their guest. Jock placed a huge soft paw into Archie's trembling hand, and Archie gingerly shook it. Jock looked bored, turned and sloped back to his guard by the fireside. Ben stoked up the fire with some heather brush and pine cones. Once they had caught a light, he placed a large lump of peat over the top. The peat belched large clouds of smoke, but finally snatched the flame. "You must be hungry, laddie. Do you like porridge?" "Oh yes, I'm starving," replied Archie, eagerly warming his hands. Looking around again, Archie asked, "What's all that stuff for?" "Och, that clutter. People leave all sorts of things behind on these mountains. I just like to keep the countryside tidy, and if I can't return things to their rightful owners, I recycle them. That armchair behind you is stuffed with hats and scarves." "First time I found a boy, though," chuckled Ben as he lifted a pile of antlers from a second armchair which sat on the other side of the fireplace. "What are those for?" Archie inquired. "Och, now, those are red and roe deer antler. I gather them up from all over the cows and moors. They've been cast off by their owners, and I make them into all kinds of things," Ben said importantly. "What kinds of things?" Archie was at last warming up. "Oh, well, sonny, don't get me started," Ben chortled happily. "Handles for walking sticks, whistles, buttons, you name it, even spurtles." "Spurtles? What's spurtles?" Archie looked confused. "You don't know what a spurtle is? Give me strength. Well, I can tell you. We'll be needing one right now to stir your porridge." Ben took a well-worn length of wood with a carefully carved antler handle and purposefully stirred the bubbling oats and water in the big black pot that hung over the fire. Archie and Ben pulled their armchairs closer to the hearth and warmed their feet and supped on large bowls of porridge with large dollops of heather honey stirred in. Jock the dog looked on hungrily. The wind and the snow raged outside. Archie closed his eyes, and the heat of the fire had made him feel very sleepy. The fire crackled, and Ben carved and whittled on a small piece of antler. Ship, ship, ship went the knife as it hewed and sculpted. The winds whistled and roared and rattled relentlessly at the doorway to the cave, taunting, determined to break in and wreak havoc. But the shelter stone had stood the test of many centuries of hungry storms and kept the folks inside safe, warm and dry no matter what. Eventually the storm would get tired moaning and blow itself out, and calm and quiet would return to the high tundra. Eventually Archie awoke to find Jock wagging his tail enthusiastically. The porridge pot was now empty. Jock had some telltale oaty blobs stuck to his whiskers. Ben looked up from his antler work and gestured towards the door. "Take a look, Sonny." Jumping down from his chair, Archie limped across the room towards the entrance. On pulling back the tartan curtain, the brightness outside was instantly blinding. As his eyes adjusted to the light, Archie stood in awe at the splendour staring back at him. It looked like a counterpane of colossal white waves, at the foot of which nestled a cold, glistening sapphire of a lochen. Above all of this, the sky clear and blue. At the loch side, a red deer stag lapped. The sun was burning bright. He could feel its warmth against his face. "Now, laddie, it's cleared up to be grand. We'll hook up Jock to the sledge and we'll have you home in no time." Jock did not look quite so convinced as his reins were attached to the wooden sleigh. He rolled his eyes. Ben jumped on the back and Archie sat comfortably in the middle, covered by a thick, closey plaid blanket. Once Jock had warmed up, he set a lightning pace. The sleigh whistled effortlessly along the mountainside. Archie felt as though they were flying, chasing blue hare that had been struggling to find a morsel of food, their big doe eyes blinking at the sight. Over huge moguls, like a fantastic roller coaster, Jock tore down the slopes. Who would have guessed the sleepy old mutt would have leapt into such action? Eventually, the sleigh began to slow down. There were more trees to negotiate in this lower ground, majestic granny pines with warm pink bark and great dark needle-clad heads pointing out the way ahead. Jock ambled at a walking pace now. The trees cleared, and before them sprawled a silent, glistening loch. Ben drew the sleigh to a halt. In the distance, Archie could hear a strange hum. Ben was now looking skyward. Shielding his eyes with his hand, he squinted into the sunlight. The sound was becoming a distinct buzz. Louder and louder the buzzing became. Now a large, dark shadow was casting across the sandy shoreline. Suddenly, with a great roar, a large, flashing, yellow helicopter appeared as if from nowhere. "Looks like that's your lift home," Ben shouted above the noise and beckoned Archie to climb out of the sleigh. Archie's eyes widened as the great hulk of the machine droned above them. It hovered. The crew peered down and signalled the thumbs up. Archie jumped up and down with excitement. "That ankle seems better," Ben boomed, smiling and his hair flying wildly. "Oh, much better, thank you, Ben," Archie grinned. "Here, take this." Ben grinned now and handed Archie a small antler whistle. "If you're ever in trouble, give it a blast, sonny." Archie looked admiringly at the beautifully carved gift. He grasped it tightly in his hand and looked up to say thank you and hug his dear friend in gratitude. But Ben, Jock, and the sleigh had gone. The helicopter rocked slightly as it landed on the lochside beach. Sand blew in gusts all around. A door opened and a man in a flying suit leapt out and ran towards them. "Archie? Archie McIntosh!" The man shouted over the whir of the rotors. "Yes, that's me." Archie nodded excitedly. "Thank goodness." The man knelt down beside the boy and put an arm on his shoulder. "When the mountain rescue received a call from your teacher, we were seriously worried about you, young man. Not many folks will survive those kind of wintry conditions, let alone a wee boy. You must be frozen." "Oh no, I'm fine. I met a giant called Ben and he took me to the school bus, but my class had already gone and there was a big storm, so we stayed at the shelter stone. I had porridge and we went on a sleigh with a flying dog called Jock," Archie replied breathlessly. "Well, I don't know how you survived that storm, But I think we need to get you checked out at the health centre. You sound a bit delirious to me." The mountain rescue man scratched his head as the little boy recounted his strange tale. "Well, whatever happened, it's nothing short of a miracle that you're here in one piece. Come on, let's get you home safe." Before climbing into the helicopter, Archie looked round once more to where his friends had stood. He pulled the little antler whistle out of his pocket. "Thank you, Ben," he whispered. Ben Macdui.